On a Friday evening in April 2025, as the sun dipped behind the thick walls of South Carolina's Central Correctional Institution, a chapter closed on one of America's rarest punishments. 42-year-old Mikal Deen Mahdi was executed by firing squad, a method so uncommon in the modern United States that it made headlines around the world. His story, though, began decades earlier, winding through childhood trauma, violent crime, and the relentless machinery of justice. Before the shots were fired, before his final meal was served, before the quiet ended in a single echoing moment, there was a path of destruction that demanded its own telling. Mikal Deen Mahdi's life began in 1983, deep in the heart of rural South Carolina, a place where poverty and instability shaped nearly every childhood memory. His family life was fractured from the start. His mother disappeared when he was just 6, leaving behind a silence that was never filled. His father, unable to cope, slipped into addiction, drifting through odd jobs and periods of absence. As a child, Mahdi found little stability. He shuffled between foster homes and distant relatives, sometimes landing in shelters, rarely in one place for long. School records describe a boy withdrawn and brooding, quick to anger, and prone to destructive outbursts, windows shattered, furniture broken, trust eroded. By 13, Mahdi's troubles had escalated. He was institutionalized, social workers noting deep patterns of self-harm and aggression. Expulsions followed at several schools, and before long, the courts labeled him a persistent juvenile offender. Petty crimes evolved into more serious offenses, breaking and entering, armed robbery, and assault. With every new arrest, the sense of hope around him faded. Even then, few could have imagined the dark, violent path Mahdi's life would ultimately take, or just how far he would one day fall. On the morning of July 14, 2004, Mahdi, then 21, made a decision that would seal his fate. It began with a simple burglary in his Virginia neighborhood. Breaking into his neighbor's garage, he stole a pistol and a battered blue station wagon, along with a set of license plates. The next day, Mahdi crossed into North Carolina, the stolen gun tucked under his jacket. He entered a small, family-run convenience store in Winston-Salem, cradling a cheap beer in his hand. Behind the counter stood Christopher Jason Boggs, a 29-year-old clerk known for his easy smile and patient manner. Surveillance footage later captured the moment. Mahdi walked up to the register, handed over the beer, and waited as Boggs asked for ID. Without a word, Mahdi pulled the pistol and fired. The first bullet struck Boggs in the jaw, dropping him instantly. Mahdi didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, aimed, and delivered a second shot to the chest. Within seconds, Boggs was dead on the floor. What happened next was coldly methodical. Mahdi tried and failed to open the register. Instead, he rifled through Boggs's pockets, took what cash he could find, grabbed the beer, and strolled out. He didn't run. He didn't look back. Moments later, he was behind the wheel again, steering the stolen car south toward South Carolina. 3 days after the murder of Christopher Boggs on July 17th, Mahdi's path intersected with another unsuspecting victim. In downtown Columbia, South Carolina, Mahdi carjacked a man at gunpoint, swapped the license plates yet again, and drove off in the victim's pickup. He headed to a nearby gas station where his attempt to use a stolen credit card aroused suspicion. The clerk, uneasy, made a quiet call to the police. But Mahdi was gone before they arrived. He abandoned the truck on a country road, slipped through a tangle of overgrown fields, and found his way onto the property of James Edward Myers, a 56-year-old police captain. Myers was away, celebrating his daughter's birthday with his wife and 5 children. By the time Myers returned home, Mahdi was waiting. He had found the captain's workshop, discovered a cache of hunting rifles, and armed himself with a .22 caliber rifle. When Myers walked through the door, Mahdi shot him without warning. 3 bullets struck Myers in the head, another tore through his heart. The attack was savage, deliberate, and final. To erase evidence, Mahdi doused the body with diesel and set it aflame, then stole the family's truck and weapons, driving off as if nothing had happened. When Myers's wife, Amy, a sheriff's deputy herself, found the scene, the horror was indescribable. The shed, where they'd taken wedding photos just a year earlier, was now a tableau of violence. The memory of that day would haunt her and her family for the rest of their lives. News of the double murder tore through the Carolinas like wildfire. The crimes, a brutal killing of a police captain and a cold-blooded shooting in a convenience store, sent shockwaves through communities already on edge. With charges spanning murder, carjacking, burglary, and grand larceny, law enforcement from multiple states joined forces, launching an intense manhunt. As investigators scrambled, Mahdi kept moving, his trail leading south. He crossed the border into Florida, recklessly weaving through highways in the stolen truck, desperate to stay ahead of authorities. But freedom was fleeting. On July 21, 2004, a series of frantic 911 calls in Satellite Beach reported a dangerous driver. Officers closed in, trying to corner Mahdi, who leapt from the truck with a rifle, but dropped it in a split-second decision and bolted on foot. The chase ended in moments. Officers wrestled him to the ground, ending a violent, week-long spree. Within days, Mahdi was back in South Carolina, facing a long list of charges, murder, arson, and armed robbery among them. But the story was far from over. For Mahdi, this was only the beginning of a long, twisting journey through the courts, prison walls, and the shadow of death row. What came next was a drawn-out legal war that gripped South Carolina's courts for years. The prosecution wasted no time in casting Mahdi as the embodiment of cold-blooded violence, a man incapable of remorse, whose actions seemed almost calculated to shock. They recounted his violent history, his run from the law, and the calculated brutality of each crime. To the jury, Mahdi was painted as a dangerous predator who had chosen his path and deserved the ultimate punishment. On the other side, Mahdi's defense attorneys tried to shift the narrative. They told the story of a life broken from the start, of a young man abandoned and abused, shuffled between group homes and foster care. They brought in psychologists who described Mahdi's long struggle with depression, a possible personality disorder, and repeated suicidal behavior. But the emotional appeals fell flat with those who mattered most. The families of Christopher Boggs and James Myers sat in the courtroom, listening, unmoved. Nothing could justify their loss. No psychological diagnosis could bring their loved ones back. After weeks of tense courtroom drama and exhaustive testimony, Mahdi entered a guilty plea. In December 2006, the judge handed down the ultimate sentence: death for the murder of Captain James Myers and life without parole for the murder of Christopher Boggs. As the verdict was read, the courtroom, filled with grieving relatives and stunned observers, fell into a hush, a collective exhale of relief and exhaustion. Still, for Mahdi and for everyone touched by the case, the journey through the justice system was far from finished. Mahdi's years on death row were marked by violence and unrest. In 2009, 5 years after his conviction, he and fellow inmate Quincy Allen, himself awaiting execution, planned a deadly ambush. Together, they lured a corrections officer to the yard under the pretense of a game of basketball. Once outside, they attacked, stabbing the officer repeatedly. Though the guard survived, his career and peace of mind did not. The aftermath was swift. Mahdi was stripped of all privileges, his world reduced to a cell and the endless waiting of appeals. Yet, for more than a decade, executions in South Carolina came to a standstill. The state was unable to obtain the drugs required for lethal injection. Appeals mounted, and Mahdi's lawyers fought every step, arguing that execution by any method would amount to cruel and unusual punishment. By 2023, South Carolina lawmakers, frustrated by years of delays, rewrote the rules. They reinstated the electric chair and, in a move that stunned much of the country, approved the firing squad as a legal method of execution. Mahdi's appeals exhausted. His name returned to the top of the execution list. In March 2025, the governor signed his death warrant, giving him until the end of the month to choose his fate: lethal injection, electrocution, or firing squad. If he refused, the state would choose for him. Mahdi, like Brad Keith Sigmund before him, chose the firing squad. His lawyers later explained his thinking. He feared the pain of electrocution, dreaded the slow suffocation of lethal injection. The firing squad, to him, seemed the least agonizing, a quick end to a long, tormented life. As the execution date approached, Mahdi was allowed to order a last meal. He asked for a ribeye steak, cooked medium, accompanied by mushroom risotto, steamed broccoli, collard greens, a generous slice of cheesecake, and a tall glass of sweet tea. It was a Southern feast, familiar, comforting, maybe one last link to the outside world he'd left behind decades earlier. On April 11th, 2025, the prison was locked down. Guards escorted Mahdi to a stark, windowless chamber, where both the electric chair and the newly constructed firing squad apparatus waited. The walls, lined with bullet-resistant glass, allowed witnesses to observe but protected them from stray rounds. 3 correctional officers, faces obscured, prepared for the task ahead. Mahdi wore a simple prison jumpsuit. His head was covered with a black hood, and a circular target was placed over his heart. He was strapped upright in a metal chair, his arms restrained, his feet immobilized. Behind a thick wall stood the 3 marksmen, each armed with a .308 caliber rifle. Only one rifle was loaded with a live round. The others fired blanks, sparing the officers from knowing who fired the fatal shot. At precisely 6:01 p.m., the warden read out the death warrant. Mahdi, offered the opportunity for final words, said nothing. He never once looked at the witnesses, among them his attorney, several journalists, and relatives of the victims. When the order was given, the room fell utterly silent. The only sounds were the soft click of rifle safeties being released. The command was spoken, and the rifles fired in perfect unison. The impact was immediate. Mahdi's body jerked sharply against the restraints, a single, guttural cry breaking the hush. For nearly a minute and a half, he drew ragged, shallow breaths, chest heaving, as blood began to pool on his jumpsuit. Witnesses described the scene as brutal, disturbing, and hauntingly quiet. Some said it felt like time had stopped. A prison doctor, waiting nearby, moved quickly to check Mahdi's vital signs. At 6:05 p.m., he was pronounced dead, 4 minutes after the execution began. Mahdi never spoke a word in those final moments. The only sound, apart from the gunshots, was his breathing, a slow, fading gasp that marked the end of a violent life and a long wait for justice. The firing squad execution drew sharp reactions nationwide. Some called it barbaric. Others saw it as a fitting end for a man who'd left so much pain in his wake. For the families of James Myers and Christopher Boggs, it was a complicated closure. An answer, perhaps, but never enough to erase the grief. By the time he died, Mikal Deen Mahdi had spent nearly 70% of his life behind bars, drifting through the American criminal justice system from the age of 13. His story is a mirror, reflecting both the failures that shaped him and the violence he unleashed. For a few minutes on an April night, in a prison chamber far from public view, the long arc of his story reached its final, echoing conclusion. Whether it was justice, retribution, or simply the last stop on a tragic road, only history and the families left behind can decide.